Hello my dear friends, and welcome back to another Star Wars news update. Bespin Bulletin have revealed that the upcoming Star Wars show Skeleton Crew, that was first announced at Star Wars Celebration, has just begun filming. The series starring Jude Law is being helmed by Jon Watts and Christopher Ford, with creative input as ever by Jon Favreau. Now the show is about 4 kids lost in the Star Wars universe, but it is by no means a kids show. And what's more is that this series is set during the Mandoverse, 5 years after the events of the Battle of Andor. Now while I've commented on the show in past news updates, I thought today we'd take a magnifying glass to it and begin speculating on what the show might be about. Having been formally described as Stranger Things in space, and having heard what Filoni and Favreau said about the project in Anaheim 6 weeks ago, what seems clear is that this series is going to be darker than any Star Wars show that we've had so far, and yes, that includes Obi-Wan Kenobi. In one sense, a grittier, darker tone makes it perfect for the small screen as a TV show, but it begs the question of what the show will bring to the table from a narrative perspective. When Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni mapped out their Mandalorian timeline, they envisioned the Book of Boba Fett, Ahsoka, Rangers of the New Republic, and at least 4 seasons of the main show The Mandalorian. But now with Rangers of the New Republic having been shelved, it's up to the other series to take on some of the subplots that would have been included in that show. And while The Mandalorian will take on some of that burden, I'm sure Skeleton Crew might do as well. You see, when it comes to the Mandoverse, each of these series focuses on our protagonists and their personal journeys. But how do you tell a story that moves beyond that scale and shows you the galaxy at large? Enter the Skeleton Crew. If Lucasfilm are trying to tell a story that eventually shows us the galaxy's dark underbelly, the rise of the First Order, and other activity from the Imperial Remnant, it's difficult to shoehorn everything into the Mandalorian or the Ahsoka series, which already deal with characters that have their own thing going on. But what would be really clever as an idea is to have this group of children explore this time period for themselves and accidentally come across things that they're not supposed to see, and in turn, we as the viewers get a much better understanding of what's going on in the seedier parts of the galaxy at this point. And just generally, we get a better overall picture of the landscape of this point in the timeline and how that could affect the other shows and our heroes. That, in my opinion, is a very smart way to utilize a show like Skeleton Crew. While in many ways it will be its own standalone adventure, it also serves the wider narrative purpose, which is probably why they set the events to run concurrently with The Mandalorian. And this also allows for the possibility of overlap, and I do want to come back to this idea a little bit later. Now, in my opinion, the genesis of all of this was when The Mandalorian Chapter 12 The Siege showed us the bigger picture, that from this point on, the show's role was no longer just to tell the story of Djarin, Grogu, and their allies, but was also to connect the dots that relate to what the deceased Darth Sidious had planned for his contingency, which does go back a long way. Now, some fans say that Dave Filoni saved the prequel trilogy with the Clone Wars, which in the eyes of many fans gave it more context, while now he may be trying to do the same thing with the sequel trilogy through the Mandoverse, trying to salvage how fans perceive it by giving it more substance, context, and build-up. And if everything makes sense and it's an enjoyable journey, it could soften the blow for many fans who were not pleased with the way the trilogy turned out. And I do think Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau have the responsibility of telling good stories that lead up to it. And I should say, with a lot of this conjecture, I'm making the assumption that Skeleton Crew is going to be a darker series that brings in elements of horror and suspense, but after all, that's the way it was described in pre-production, Stranger Things in space. But a question we also have to ask is, who are these kids? Are they Force sensitive? Were they kidnapped? How did they end up lost in space? Did they know Grogu? These are the questions that should be our starting point. And if they were kidnapped, was it for their midichlorian count as part of Palpatine's cloning project? And Palpatine was doing that for decades. If you remember early on in the Clone Wars, Ahsoka helped save Force-sensitive children from being captured and used by a faceless enemy. And audiences knew what Ahsoka didn't, that Palpatine was behind the kidnapping attempt, and his motives were pure evil. It was no accident that decades later, when Ezra Bridger and his friends discovered that Inquisitors were kidnapping Force-sensitive babies, Ahsoka showed up again to save those lives. And then later in the timeline, in The Mandalorian Season 2, Ahsoka comes across Grogu, one of the most devastating examples of Palpatine's crimes. And even though Palpatine's long dead, the Imperial Remnant, with the help of Dr. Pershing, were using blood from Grogu and maybe other Force sensitives as part of the Emperor's plan to eventually return in the most sinister way through cloning projects. And we're going to see a lot more of this in the Mandoverse, and I think Skeleton Crew could be a great example of that. Grogu is a very dark yet hopeful example of one of those children who survived, but he couldn't have been the only one. What happened to all of the other children? Could these 4 protagonists in Skeleton Crew be part of that? It's a dark prospect, but one that is perfect for Star Wars television. So share your thoughts in the comments down below, guys. What do you think Skeleton Crew is going to be about? And what sort of characters and storylines would you expect in a show like this? If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give me a big fat thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and I'll see you in the next one. May the Force be with you always. I'm Star Wars Meg. Have a good one. Skeleton Crew was first announced at Star Wars Celebration. I was ecstatic. Finally something different in Star Wars that takes place in an awesome era, the Mandoverse. As you guys know, I've been making quite a few Rogue One: A Star Wars Story videos recently, and this one is just for you. 2016's Rogue One: A Star Wars Story is set before the events of A New Hope, and therefore before the film dropped, many Star Wars fans were hoping to see a couple of characters from the original trilogy. And when you're talking about the Rebel Alliance, we obviously have to speak about Admiral Akbar, the Mon Calamari soldier that was first introduced in Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, and he also helped lead the Rebel forces in their final assault on the second Death Star. Now, in terms of the sequel trilogy, Admiral Akbar was brought back for Episode 7, The Force Awakens, but unfortunately, and I can't stand this fact, he was killed off-screen in The Last Jedi. So Disney Star Wars has in many ways acknowledged him,